On the afternoon of August 27, 1776, a line of exhausted American soldiers stumbled backward through the fields of western Long Island. Behind them came the steady crash of British volleys. Ahead of them lay only one narrow escape route across the marshes toward Brooklyn Heights, where George Washington was desperately trying to save what remained of the Continental Army. Then, an officer looked toward the stone farmhouse that stood beside the road and realized something terrifying. British troops were already closing in from two directions. If they reached that crossing first, nearly 9,000 American soldiers would be trapped against the East River with nowhere left to retreat. At that moment, roughly 400 men received an order that almost guaranteed they would never leave the battlefield alive. They were not asked to win. They were not even asked to survive. They were ordered to attack an enemy force several times their own size, again and again, until the rest of the army escaped. Within hours, most of them would be dead or prisoners. Yet because of those repeated attacks, George Washington's army remained intact. 3 nights later, that same army would disappear across the East River under the noses of the British, preserving the revolution at the very moment it seemed certain to collapse. This is not simply the story of extraordinary courage. It is the story of one of the greatest rearguard actions of the American Revolution, a military mechanism so effective that a few hundred soldiers bought enough time to save an entire army. The Battle of Long Island was supposed to end the war. During the summer of 1776, only weeks after the Declaration of Independence had been signed, Britain launched the largest overseas expedition it had ever assembled. More than 30,000 British and German troops supported by the Royal Navy gathered around New York Harbor. Their objective was straightforward: destroy Washington's army in one decisive campaign before the rebellion could mature into a real nation. The British possessed almost every conceivable advantage. Their infantry had spent years drilling together. Their officers were veterans of the 7 Years' War. The Royal Navy controlled every major waterway around New York, allowing troops and supplies to move almost at will. Washington, by contrast, commanded an army that looked impressive on paper, but remained a fragile coalition of Continentals and short-term militia. Many regiments had never fought a major battle. Ammunition was uneven, discipline varied from unit to unit, and countless enlistments would expire before the end of the year. Yet Washington understood something equally important. If New York fell, another city could be defended. If the Continental Army disappeared, the Revolution itself might disappear with it. British Commander General William Howe understood that as well. Rather than launching a costly frontal assault, he planned something far more dangerous. While thousands of British troops fixed the Americans in place, another column would march through the lightly guarded Jamaica Pass during the night, swing around the American left, and cut off every road leading back to Brooklyn Heights. It was an elegant plan. It depended on speed, discipline, and one critical assumption: that the Americans would not discover the maneuver until it was too late. The assumption proved correct. Before dawn, Howe's turning column had slipped behind the American lines almost unnoticed. As daylight spread across the fields, Continental officers suddenly realized that British troops were appearing where no British troops should have been. Units that believed they were holding the front now found enemies advancing from their flank and rear. Orders became confused. Entire regiments began withdrawing independently as commanders struggled to understand what had happened. The battle was no longer about holding Long Island. It had become a race. Could Washington pull thousands of soldiers back before Howe slammed the trap shut? Everything now depended on a single stretch of ground near an old Dutch farmhouse built from thick stone walls nearly 80 years earlier. That place would soon become one of the bloodiest fields of the entire American Revolution. For a few desperate hours on the western edge of Long Island, the American army ceased to exist as a single organized force. Instead, it broke into isolated pockets of men trying to escape before the British closed the last open road. General George Washington rode constantly between collapsing positions, attempting to piece together reports that contradicted one another almost as quickly as they arrived. Officers spoke of British columns appearing from unexpected directions. Messengers disappeared before delivering orders. Entire regiments were falling back through woods so thick that commanders often had no idea where neighboring units were. Yet one fact became painfully clear. The British advance was converging on Gowanus Road, the narrow corridor leading toward Brooklyn Heights. If Cornwallis reached that road before the retreat was complete, thousands of American soldiers would be trapped between British infantry and the tidal marshes surrounding Gowanus Creek. The Revolution's main army would not simply lose a battle. It could disappear in a single afternoon. Someone had to buy time. The responsibility fell largely upon Major General William Alexander, better known as Lord Stirling. Although born in New York, Stirling had claimed a Scottish title that Britain refused to recognize. Ironically, the man rejected by the crown was now preparing to sacrifice his command fighting against it. His force had already been engaged for hours around the villages and farmland southwest of Brooklyn. Facing him were experienced British regulars, advancing with remarkable discipline. Every time the Americans yielded one hedgerow or orchard, another British battalion stepped forward in formation, keeping relentless pressure on the retreating defenders. Stirling quickly understood what many officers farther north had not yet realized. This was no ordinary withdrawal. His command had become the rear guard for nearly the entire Continental Army. Among the troops still under his control stood some of the finest soldiers the Americans possessed, the 1st Maryland Regiment, reinforced by elements of Delaware troops. Unlike many militia units fighting elsewhere that day, these men had spent months drilling together. Maryland's regiment had earned a reputation for discipline rare in the young Continental Army. Their officers insisted on European standards of maneuver, volley fire, and bayonet drill. They were still inexperienced compared to British veterans, but they remained one of Washington's most reliable formations. One of the officers leading them was Major Mordecai Gist, a veteran from Maryland respected for his steadiness under pressure. His men had already endured hours of fighting and withdrawal, yet, unlike many surrounding units, they had not dissolved into confusion. Now they received a mission unlike any they had faced before. The battlefield itself dictated what had to happen next. Near today's Park Slope stood the Old Stone House, a sturdy Dutch farmhouse built decades before the Revolution. Thick stone walls overlooked open fields divided by fences, orchards, and drainage ditches. To its west stretched marshland cut by creeks and narrow causeways. Large formations could not maneuver freely there. Every road narrowed, every crossing became a choke point. For Cornwallis, capturing this ground meant opening the final approach toward Brooklyn Heights. For the Americans, delaying him there meant survival. The mathematics were brutal. Several thousand Continental soldiers were still streaming toward safety. Wagons clogged the roads. Artillery struggled through muddy ground. Units mixed together as officers shouted conflicting directions over the roar of musketry. They did not need hours. They needed minutes. Enough minutes for the retreat to continue without collapsing into panic. Stirling studied the ground and reached the only conclusion available to him. A defensive line alone would not hold. If his men merely waited behind fences, British artillery and disciplined infantry would gradually overwhelm them. Cornwallis possessed superior numbers, better reserves, and the initiative. Passive resistance would simply slow the inevitable. Instead, the British advance had to be interrupted. Again and again. Every fresh attack would force British commanders to halt, deploy, exchange volleys, reorganize their formations, and only then resume advancing. None of those pauses seemed significant by themselves. Together, they could buy exactly what Washington needed. It was an extraordinarily expensive calculation. The officers understood that every counterattack reduced the chances of their own survival. Charging forward against fresh British regulars was not a path to victory. It was a deliberate exchange of lives for time. According to later accounts, Stirling gathered the Maryland troops and explained the necessity of holding the enemy while the remainder of the army escaped. No elaborate speeches survived from that moment. None were needed. The men could already see the truth unfolding across the fields. Behind them, thousands of comrades continued withdrawing toward Brooklyn. Ahead of them stood an army they could not possibly defeat. Then the order came. The Marylanders turned, dressed their ranks one final time, and advanced toward the Old Stone House, not to break the British line, but to force one of the most powerful armies in the world to stop advancing, if only for a few more precious minutes. Within moments, the first of their repeated charges would begin. The first attack came without illusion. The Maryland and Delaware soldiers were not advancing to seize ground or destroy the British line. Their objective was far more precise and far more desperate. Every minute they forced Cornwallis to spend deploying, firing, and reorganizing his battalions was another minute in which hundreds of Continental soldiers could move closer to Brooklyn Heights. Military historians often describe rearguard actions as defensive operations. This one was anything but passive. Instead of waiting behind fences to be overwhelmed, Sterling chose to strike first. If the British were allowed to maintain their momentum, the retreat would collapse. But if that momentum could be broken repeatedly, the entire timetable of Howe's operation would begin to slip. Across the fields surrounding the old stone house, British regulars advanced in disciplined formations. Companies paused to dress their lines, officers corrected intervals, drums signaled movements, and artillery was brought forward to support the infantry. Everything reflected years of professional training. Then, out of the smoke, the Americans charged. The sudden counterattack forced the leading British units to stop almost immediately. Instead of pressing forward toward the retreat routes, they had to pivot into battle formation. Muskets crashed almost simultaneously as volleys erupted across the fields. Thick white smoke rolled over fences and orchards, reducing visibility to only a few dozen yards. Officers struggled to identify friend from foe as commands were swallowed by gunfire. The Americans could not remain exposed for long. After exchanging volleys at close range, they fell back toward cover before British numbers could envelop them. The maneuver looked like another retreat. It wasn't. It was the first interruption. As soon as Cornwallis's troops restored their formations and resumed advancing, the Americans struck again. Every new attack forced the same sequence. Advance. Deploy. Fire. Regroup. Advance again. Under ordinary circumstances, these pauses were little more than routine battlefield procedures. On this afternoon, each one consumed something far more valuable than ammunition. It consumed time. Behind the fighting, that time translated directly into survival. Columns of Continental soldiers continued streaming toward the defenses around Brooklyn Heights. Artillery crews hauled cannon through narrow roads already congested with infantry, wagons, and wounded men. Officers who had believed themselves trapped suddenly found another few minutes to reorganize shattered regiments and continue the withdrawal in surprisingly good order. The rear guard was absorbing the pressure that would otherwise have fallen upon the retreating army. Cornwallis quickly recognized that these were not isolated acts of desperation. Someone was deliberately delaying him. The British commander responded exactly as a professional officer was expected to respond. Rather than rushing recklessly into the attacks, his infantry maintained discipline. Fresh companies were committed where resistance stiffened. Flanking movements were attempted whenever terrain allowed. Artillery was positioned to break concentrations of American troops before they could launch another charge. It was the correct tactical response, but every measured, methodical adjustment required additional minutes. Those minutes accumulated. The fighting intensified around the old stone house itself. Built of thick stone, the farmhouse became an anchor point amid the swirling battle. American soldiers used walls, fences, and nearby orchards for temporary cover before being driven back by superior British numbers. British infantry repeatedly occupied ground only to discover that the Americans had not disappeared. They had simply repositioned for another attack from a different angle. Neither side controlled the battlefield for long. Instead, it surged back and forth in violent bursts. Witnesses later recalled the extraordinary determination of the Maryland troops. Time after time, they advanced into fire that they knew they could not sustain indefinitely. Casualties mounted rapidly, officers fell, companies shrank, gaps opened in the ranks and were filled almost instinctively by the men still standing. Yet the attacks continued. From Washington's position near Brooklyn Heights, the scene unfolding in the distance was almost unbearable to watch. According to several contemporary accounts, he observed the repeated assaults through a spyglass as the remnants of Sterling's command fought against overwhelming odds. One witness later remembered Washington exclaiming, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Whether those were his exact words or a close recollection, they captured the reality before him. He understood exactly what those men were purchasing. Not victory, not even the battlefield. They were purchasing the continued existence of his army. By late afternoon, however, the cost of every additional minute had become almost impossible to bear. British reinforcements continued arriving. Fresh battalions replaced exhausted ones. The numerical imbalance grew even larger, while the American rearguard grew steadily smaller. Soon, the moment would come when one final attack was necessary. Not because it could succeed, but because there was nothing left to sacrifice except the men themselves. By late afternoon, the battlefield had narrowed to a single question. How much longer could a few hundred exhausted men delay an army that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute? The answer no longer depended on tactics alone. It depended on endurance. The Maryland and Delaware soldiers had already launched multiple counterattacks. Every advance had cost officers, sergeants, and experienced soldiers whose absence made the next assault even harder to organize. Powder fouled their muskets. The August heat mixed with smoke until visibility came and went in choking gray waves. Units that had begun the day in orderly ranks were now reduced to scattered groups, rallying around whichever officers remained alive. Across the field, the British sensed the change. The resistance was still fierce, but it was becoming thinner. Cornwallis ordered his troops to maintain relentless pressure. Fresh companies rotated into the fight, while tired battalions reorganized behind them. The British system was working exactly as intended. Professional discipline allowed one unit to continue the attack while another recovered, ensuring that the advance never truly stopped. The Americans had no such luxury. Every casualty permanently reduced the force standing between the British and Washington's retreat. Yet this apparent weakness concealed one final advantage. The British still could not know how much of the Continental Army had escaped. Every new American attack suggested that substantial forces might still be defending the approaches to Brooklyn Heights. Instead of racing recklessly forward, British commanders continued advancing methodically, clearing each position before moving to the next. It was the correct military decision, but it meant that uncertainty continued, slowing the pursuit. That uncertainty was exactly what Sterling needed. Seeing the British pressing closer to the crossing near Gowanus Creek, he made one final calculation. If his remaining men could strike once more, even briefly, the last elements of the retreat might reach safety. He selected the strongest soldiers still capable of fighting, primarily the Marylanders under Major Mordecai Gist, and pointed them toward the British line surrounding the old stone house. It would become the most famous charge of the battle. The Americans advanced across open ground with bayonets fixed, as British muskets erupted in disciplined volleys. Men fell almost immediately, but the survivors kept moving. They reached fences, pushed through orchards, and closed the distance before another crashing volley tore fresh gaps through their ranks. For a moment, fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted around the stone house and its surrounding farm buildings. Smoke drifted between the walls as officers struggled to control the chaos. Neither side could see more than fragments of the battlefield, only flashes of movement and bursts of musket fire through the haze. The charge could not break the British position. It was never expected to. But it accomplished something almost as valuable. Once again, Cornwallis's advance halted while his troops fought off the assault, restored their formations, and secured the ground around the farmhouse. Another stretch of precious time disappeared into close combat instead of pursuit. Behind them, the retreat continued. Hundreds became thousands. Regiments that had seemed doomed only an hour earlier crossed the marshes and reached the defensive works around Brooklyn Heights. Cannon rolled into position. Officers reassembled shattered commands. Washington's army, though battered, remained an army. The rear guard had succeeded. Only now did the inevitable happen. The surviving Marylanders found themselves surrounded. British infantry closed from multiple directions while Hessian troops blocked potential escape routes. The marshes that had protected the American withdrawal now became deadly obstacles for those left behind. Some soldiers attempted to fight their way through. Others plunged into Gowanus Creek, weighed down by muskets, cartridge boxes, and heavy wool uniforms. Many drowned before reaching the opposite bank. Others were shot in the water or captured as they struggled through the mud. Lord Sterling recognized that further resistance would accomplish nothing. Rather than surrendering to the British troops directly in front of him, he crossed the lines under a flag of truce and formally yielded his sword to the Hessian commander, General Johann von Heister. believing it more honorable than surrendering to officers he considered his former countrymen. When the firing finally subsided, the fields around the old stone house were covered with the cost of those final attacks. Of the roughly 400 Maryland and Delaware soldiers who had formed the heart of the rear guard, only a fraction returned to American lines. Historians continue to debate the exact figures, but there is no dispute about the scale of the sacrifice. The regiment had been shattered. Entire companies had virtually ceased to exist. Yet the exchange had altered the course of the campaign. The British had won a decisive tactical victory. They had not destroyed Washington's army, and that single difference would haunt British strategy far more than anyone on the battlefield could yet understand. When the sun finally began to sink over western Long Island on August 27, 1776, the battlefield belonged to Britain. General William Howe had achieved almost everything a commander could ask for. His army had driven the Americans from their forward defenses, inflicted heavy casualties, captured prisoners, and forced Washington's men back into the fortified lines around Brooklyn Heights. On paper, it was one of the most decisive victories of the Revolutionary War. But Howe's original objective had never been to win a battle. It had been to destroy an army. And despite everything that had happened throughout the day, George Washington's army was still alive. From the British perspective, the situation appeared favorable enough to justify caution. The Americans had withdrawn into prepared earthworks overlooking Brooklyn. Assaulting fortified positions after the experience at Bunker Hill carried obvious risks. Howe had seen what determined defenders behind field fortifications could do to attacking regulars, even when badly outnumbered. There was little reason to spend British lives on an immediate frontal attack when the Continental Army appeared trapped against the East River. So instead of ordering one final assault before nightfall, Howe halted. The decision has been debated by historians for more than 2 centuries. Some argue that his troops had marched and fought for nearly an entire day and needed time to reorganize. Others point to the confusion of the battlefield, uncertainty about American strength inside the Brooklyn defenses, or Howe's preference throughout the campaign for methodical operations rather than costly gambles. Whatever the combination of reasons, one fact remains undeniable. The pause gave Washington exactly what he had been fighting to obtain all day: time. Inside the American lines, the atmosphere was grim. Thousands of soldiers crowded the defensive perimeter overlooking the East River. Many had become separated from their regiments. Officers spent hours trying to rebuild shattered commands from exhausted men arriving in small groups. Ammunition had to be redistributed. Cannon were repositioned behind hastily strengthened earthworks. Wounded soldiers filled makeshift hospitals, while patrols watched anxiously for signs of a renewed British assault at dawn. Washington understood that remaining where he was invited disaster. The British controlled the surrounding countryside. Their artillery could gradually tighten the siege, while the Royal Navy might sail into the East River and cut off every avenue of escape. If that happened, the Continental Army would eventually be forced into surrender. There was only one realistic option. The army had to cross the river. Doing so seemed almost impossible. Moving nearly 9,000 soldiers, along with artillery, horses, ammunition, and supplies, across a wide tidal river required hundreds of boats, strict discipline, and absolute secrecy. One premature alarm, one British reconnaissance patrol, or one warship entering the East River at the wrong moment could turn the withdrawal into catastrophe. Yet the Americans possessed one advantage that had been purchased at terrible cost. Because the Marylanders and Delaware troops had delayed the British advance for so long, the Continental Army had reached Brooklyn Heights in relatively good order. Washington still commanded organized brigades rather than scattered fugitives. Officers remained in control of their men. Artillery had not been abandoned wholesale. Most importantly, panic had never consumed the retreat. The rear guard had not merely saved lives, it had preserved the Army's ability to function. On the evening of August 29th, fishermen, sailors, and civilian boatmen from Massachusetts quietly assembled every available vessel they could find. Under the direction of Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead mariners, the evacuation began after darkness fell. Hour after hour, boats crossed the East River carrying soldiers to Manhattan. Washington refused to leave until nearly every unit had crossed. Then nature intervened. Shortly before dawn, A dense fog drifted over the river and settled across Brooklyn Heights. Visibility collapsed. From the British positions only a short distance away, the American lines remained hidden beneath a gray curtain. The final regiments boarded the waiting boats while the fog concealed movements that otherwise would have been impossible to disguise. By sunrise, the last Continental soldiers had crossed safely. When British patrols finally advanced into the abandoned American fortifications, they found empty trenches, discarded equipment, and silent camps. Washington's army had vanished. The Battle of Long Island ended as a clear British victory. But the campaign that was supposed to crush the revolution had failed to eliminate its most important target. Britain had captured ground. Washington had preserved the army. And in 18th century warfare, an army that escaped could fight again. Everything that followed, from Trenton to Princeton, from Saratoga to Yorktown, would only be possible because, on one desperate afternoon outside Brooklyn, a few hundred soldiers had exchanged their lives for the one resource no commander could ever replace. The sacrifice at the old stone house did not reverse the outcome of the Battle of Long Island. The British still held the field. They occupied New York only weeks later, forcing Washington into another retreat. From a purely tactical perspective, the campaign belonged to General Howe. Yet wars are not decided by tactical victories alone. They are decided by whether those victories accomplish their strategic purpose. In August 1776, Britain's purpose was clear: destroy the Continental Army, force the rebellion to collapse before it could become a permanent war. That objective was never achieved. The rearguard action fought by the Maryland and Delaware soldiers illustrates one of the oldest principles in military history. Sometimes preserving a fighting force is far more valuable than holding ground. Cities can be abandoned, fortifications can be rebuilt, territory can change hands repeatedly. An experienced army cannot be replaced overnight. Washington understood this better with every campaign he fought. After Long Island, he would continue withdrawing whenever necessary, refusing to gamble the entire revolution on a single battle. Critics occasionally accused him of caution, but his strategy reflected a hard reality. As long as the Continental Army remained in the field, Britain had not won the war. The events of August 27th proved exactly why. Within 4 months of escaping Brooklyn, Washington crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night and launched the surprise attack at Trenton, capturing nearly an entire Hessian garrison. Days later came another victory at Princeton, restoring American morale at a moment when enlistments were collapsing and many believed independence had little chance of survival. Neither operation would have been possible if the Continental Army had been destroyed on Long Island. Years later, that same army would endure defeats, survive brutal winters, improve through training at Valley Forge, cooperate with French allies, and eventually trap Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. The road to that decisive victory was long and uncertain, but it began with one essential fact. Washington still had an army. The men who bought that opportunity paid an extraordinary price. The soldiers remembered today as the Maryland 400 were never exactly 400, and historians continue to debate their precise numbers. The title became symbolic rather than mathematical, representing the Maryland and Delaware troops who repeatedly charged overwhelming British forces to delay the advance near the old stone house. Many never returned. Others spent years in British captivity under brutal conditions. Families back home often waited months before learning whether fathers, brothers, or sons had survived. Entire companies had to be rebuilt after the battle. For Maryland, the losses were so severe that later generations celebrated those soldiers as the regiment that saved the army. Their sacrifice also demonstrated something the British had not fully appreciated in 1776. The Continental Army was becoming more resilient with every campaign. It could lose cities without surrendering. It could lose battles without collapsing. And it could absorb terrible casualties while continuing to fight. For Britain, that transformed the conflict into a war of endurance rather than a campaign of decisive victories. Every additional year increased financial costs, stretched military resources across the Atlantic, and created new opportunities for foreign powers, most importantly France, to intervene. Looking back, it is tempting to see history as inevitable. It was anything but. Had Cornwallis reached the retreat roads even 30 minutes earlier? Had the rear guard broken after the first attack? Had panic spread through the withdrawing regiments? Had Washington failed to preserve his army? The revolution might have ended before the United States truly existed. Instead, a few hundred disciplined soldiers accepted a mission that offered almost no chance of survival because they understood that victory was no longer measured by ground captured or enemies defeated. It was measured in minutes. Those minutes became hours. Those hours became an escape. That escape became another campaign. And that campaign eventually became American independence. Sometimes the most important battle is not the one that wins the war. It is the one that prevents the war from ending. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more forgotten moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future documentaries. And now I'd like to hear from you. Do you think General Howe's decision to halt after Long Island was a prudent military choice, or the greatest missed opportunity of the American Revolution?